I love a story that's told by a first-person narrator. To me, it's so much more primal and natural and human and powerful than a story that's told by the way fiction writers usually do it, is with a third-person narrator. The third-person narrator is unattached, and they are not part of the story, and they just narrate the events of the story from one thing to the next. They tell the plot. They're like a reader, like an audiobook voice actor, or someone who just picks up a script of a movie and starts reading it. The third-person narrator is the most common way that we read fiction stories. It's the most common method used by authors to tell a story in a fiction story, in a novel especially. And it's a good technique because when you're the third-person narrator, you know everything. You have access to all information. You have access to the emotions and feelings inside the heads of all the characters. You have access to the goings-on in any part of your world that you choose to focus on. So it's a good storytelling technique because essentially you get to play God. You can be anywhere at any time, anywhere you choose to go. And so so once you know that, then you understand the inherent problems of the first-person narrator is that you're stuck in one person's head, and it's hard to bring in other plot devices, and it's hard to keep the story fresh. Obviously, there's strengths and weaknesses of both, and I'm not going to go into all that. This isn't a 101 class on narrators. There's better teachers can take you through all that. What I'm saying is that I love a story that knows it's a story. And I've been thinking about this a lot because, well, first, before I get into that, let me start talking about some examples because I think it's always best to get down to specifics. I think it's confusing. My tendency is just to stay up in the clouds and the abstract, but I think that real learning and real intelligence comes from how well you can get down to the specifics of what you're actually talking about, whether that's a lecture or a class or something you're trying to explain or just in everyday speaking. I think that's a good general rule in just your everyday life communications, is that the more you can talk about specifics and not generalities, the better off the more effective your communication will be. So I just picked up a few books off my shelf right now. The first one that I'm holding in my hand is Salem's Lot by Stephen King. So if anyone is a good example of a modern day fiction storyteller, successful storyteller, then Stephen King is a good one to use. So I just picked up Salem's Lot, and this is what it feels like. This is the prologue. This is the beginning of the story. This is what a third-person narrator sounds like and feels like. Almost everyone thought the man and the boy were father and son. They crossed the country on a rambling southwest line in an old Citroën sedan, keeping mostly to secondary roads, traveling in fits and starts. They stopped in 3 places along the way before reaching their final destination. First in Rhode Island, where the tall man with the black hair worked in a textile mill. Then in Youngstown, Ohio, where he worked for 3 months on a tractor assembly line. And finally in a small California town near the Mexican border, where he pumped gas and worked at repairing small foreign cars with an amount of success that was to him surprising and gratifying. Wherever they stopped, he got a Maine newspaper called the Portland Press Herald and watched it for items concerning a small southern Maine town named Jerusalem's Lot and the surrounding area. There were such items from time to time. Okay, so that's a great start. It's interesting. That's a fun first line. What was it? The man and the boy were traveling alone. Where'd it go? Oh, almost everyone thought the man and the boy were father and son. So that's interesting because you have a man and a boy who are obviously on the run from something, or they're hiding something, or they're fugitives somehow. They're going to all these different towns, working jobs, and the man has this obsession with Jerusalem's Lot. He's always checking the news for it. So that's a great hook. It's a great beginning to the story, and Stephen King is a master, and already we're intrigued as to what the man and the boy are doing. But my point is that with the third-person narrator, who's speaking? Stephen King is speaking. So the man is not speaking. The boy is not speaking. We are getting the voice of someone who knows everything, but we're only going to get the information doled out to us, handed out to us, one piece of information after another. So we're starting with this first piece of information, and then we're going to go from the next to the next to the next. Here's another quick example. I just picked another book off my shelf. It's A Clash of Kings by George R.R. Martin. I think this is the second book. Yeah, this is the sequel to Game of Thrones. So there's a prologue, and then the first chapter is from Arya. So here's how it starts. At Winterfell, they had called her Arya Horseface, and she'd thought nothing could be worse. But that was before the orphan boy, Lommy Greenhands, had named her Lumpyhead. Her head felt lumpy when she touched it. When Yoren had dragged her into that alley, she'd thought he meant to kill her, but the sour old man had only held her tight, sawing through her mats and tangles with his dagger. She remembered how the breeze sent the fistfuls of dirt-brown hair skittering across the paving stones toward the sept where her father had died. I'm taking men and boys from the city, Yoren growled as the sharp steel scraped at her head. You hold still. By the time he had finished, her scalp was nothing but tufts and stubble. So George R. R. Martin is writing in the third-person style, but he's writing in what's more common for fantasy writers these days, or for all fiction writers, is the third-person limited style. So it's a third-person narrator. It's not Arya who's speaking, but we are inside of Arya's head, recounting what she's done, her memories, what she's been through, and the important part of the third-person limited technique is that we don't just have access to any and all information. So if you read older fiction or older fantasy like Tolkien, if you're reading Lord of the Rings, then he'll say stuff you'll be reading about Frodo and Sam and the beginning of their adventure, and then Tolkien will throw a line in there that's something like, but the hobbits had no idea just how dangerous their adventure was about to become, or something like that. So the narrator who knows all would sort of pipe in there and tell us something that the hobbits themselves couldn't actually know. So I think that was more in fashion back in the day, and it's more out of fashion these days. It's more common to use the third-person limited technique where you do have access to all the information, but in order to make the story more relatable and personable, you stick to one, you stay close to one character. And George R. R. Martin gets away with that, or his technique is he uses a new character to tell every chapter. So he gets in the head of all of his characters, and we see it's really brilliant and genius, and I can't imagine how hard it is to wrap up a whole, especially how sprawling these books are. But even the first one, just to tell the first Game of Thrones, just to tell the story of the Starks going south to King's Landing, but then to tell that through a different narrator every chapter is, to me, that's one of the most enjoyable parts of reading the book, how he weaves all those parts together. So there you have two good examples of modern day fiction writers who are telling their stories in the third person. George R.R. Martin and Stephen King, two of the greats. So I started this podcast off by saying that I love a story that's told by a first-person narrator rather than a story that's told by a third-person narrator, because there's something human about it, something natural that goes to way back before people had novels or even written language, which you just have caveman. I was just imagining like a caveman coming back from the hunt and telling the cave woman a story about his hunt, but I was picturing it in like comic book terms. And it's funny in my head, but I will spare you doing my caveman voice impersonation right now. But you know what I mean, just that natural, just, I'm going to tell you a story about what happened to me today. Just how essential that is for communication, and how primal of a thing, how normal that is for humans to talk to each other in that way. But having said that, the distinction that I'm making here, the point of this episode, this is something that I've thought about so much over the last few years, and I'm still trying to process it and figure out exactly what it is that I feel so strongly about, or that I like about these kind of stories. And when it comes down to it, it's not really about the first person narration and the third person narration, although that's part of it. And that's why I started off with those examples, because that is part of it. There's a difference between being rooted in a story by someone who being told a story by someone who actually experienced the story, versus being told a story by a godlike narrator who just knows the story. They didn't actually experience it themselves. But the powerful thing when I say I love a story that's told by a first-person narrator, I think the thing I'm really trying to say is I love a story that knows it's a story. I love when an author can tell us the ending right off the bat. I think there's something primal about that, like your grandfather sits down at the foot of your bed and he's going to tell you, grandson, let me tell you the story of how I proposed to your grandmother. Like, you already know, it's a story. You know what you're going to get. There's something there that has to do with the packaging. When you know the ending of the story right off the bat, you know what you're going to get. And it doesn't actually spoil the story, because the story is the events. You still want to know, well, what were grandma and grandpa like before they met, and how did they meet, and whose idea was it to get married, and how did grandpa propose? Like, those are the events that make the story interesting, that you still want to hear. Or anyone who tells the story, I'm going to tell you the story of the Battle of Gettysburg, or Sir Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. You might know how these stories end. You might know what their outcomes are, but you still want to hear the events of what made that story magical. So there's different ways to do that, to have that self-awareness of the story, and that's what I'm interested in. And I think it's best done in the first-person narration because it's so natural, but it can be done a lot of different ways. So here's an example. Speaking of a grandfather sitting down at the foot of your bed, when you pick up the Chronicles of Narnia, I remember reading the Narnia books when I was a kid. my third grade teacher read them to us, and she was amazing. Now that I think about it, she was awesome. She was a really good teacher, and she she read all the Narnia books to us. And what was so cool is she would do different voices for all of the characters, and we would come to love her different voices that she did. And whenever she spoke as a girl or as a deer or as a lion, she had a voice for Aslan, and we loved listening to her. But the way that the Chronicles of Narnia works is, so you have a third person narrator, but you have that feeling, like I was saying, the grandfather sitting at the foot of the bed telling the grandchildren a story. That's what the Chronicles of Narnia feels like. So here's how Chronicles of Narnia starts, the first one. Once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Miss Macready and 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they do not come into the story much. He himself was a very old man with shaggy white hair, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so then we go on to learn about Lucy and the kids and the professor, and then it jumps into the actual the events. So now you have, it says, as soon as they had said goodnight to the professor and gone upstairs on the first night, so now we've gone from the global perspective, now we're zooming into a specific time, the first night, the boys came into the girls' room and they all talked it over. Okay, so now we know it's the first night, we know we're in the girls' room and all the kids are there, and now they're actually talking. We've fallen on our feet, and no mistake, said Peter. This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything we like. Oh, how British is Chronicles of Narnia. It's hilarious how polite and proper these kids are. So why did I bring up Chronicles of Narnia as an example of what I'm talking about? So this intro, it's a third-person story, but more so than the examples of Salem's Lot and Clash of Kings that I read, this story is self-aware. It's telling you right off the bat that it's a story. So it has, the once upon a time beginning, but then it comes out, it flat out says, this story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war. So we don't actually know the ending of the story. It doesn't say this story is about a girl who stumbled into a magical land. It doesn't say that. But it does give you that grandfather sitting at the foot of your bed feeling that he knows the story already, that he's not making it up as he goes. Later on, a few sentences later, it said, so it gives the names of the 3 servants. Their names are Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they do not come into the story much. So now the third-person narrator has twice given us the impression, which are small things, but I think really go a long way. I think you can't understate how important those little hints are at building trust in the reader. And that's really important, and I think that's something that I love about the first-person narrator and the story that knows it's a story. Because when you're reading a book, you want to know that the author has their shit together. Basically, the faster you can get that feeling, the better. The faster the author can let you know that they have their shit together and put you at ease and let you just let down your guard so that you feel like you're along for the ride, the better. And obviously there's so many ways the author can do that. Maybe it's a famous author who you already trust. Maybe it's a great book cover that looks professional and put together, as opposed to maybe getting getting like a 12 sheets of paper stapled together by a freshman student, classroom style, and reading that story the way it's presented, just the physical story. You're obviously not going to trust it right off the bat when you're reading that story from a stranger or a student who you know is not a professional. As you're reading their story, you don't have any guarantees that they have their shit together, that they know how this story is going to end, and therefore they're doing all of the proper foreshadowing and all the proper character development and all of the great things that a great storyteller does. And this was amazing to me about a year ago when I actually went back and read the first couple Chronicles of Narnia books, because I'm sure that I'm sure these, what can I say? The feeling that you get when you read this story is like a grandfather sitting down at the foot of your bed, which, if you know about the novels, well, even if you, C.S. Lewis actually wrote this, he dedicated this story to his granddaughter, Lucy, or his niece? Anyways, the author, C.S. Lewis, he has the prologue or the foreword before the book where he writes it as a dedication to a little girl. So that feeling or that emotion is baked into the whole novel series, is that a grandfather is telling this kind of fun, fantastical story to a little girl. But I think that's so important. You get those hints right off the bat that I'm going to tell you a story. I know how the story ends. I know that you don't really need to know the names of the servants because they don't matter much. The servants don't come back into the story. We're going to Narnia, and the servants don't have a place in this story. What's important are the kids. So we're going to jump now to this scene where the four kids are talking. And to go back again to talking about a novice writer or a beginning writer, or say you just go to Walmart, or you just buy any old book on Amazon and it's a fiction story. So maybe you pick up a horror story or a crime thriller or a romance story. When you first start reading from that third-person narrator, if it's a bad author, or if it's an inexperienced author, or if it's a, those are the two things. Either a new author and an inexperienced author, they might leave some stuff in. Like if they were writing the Chronicles of Narnia, that author might actually tell us all about the three servants, Ivy and Margaret, whatever their names are. They might describe in detail the features and the feelings of the three servants, because at the time they wrote it, they didn't know exactly how their story was going to end, or because they just lacked the focus and the clarity to know that they should cut that shit out because the story isn't really about the three servants and none of them are that important. Okay, so I've given 3 examples: Salem's Lot, Clash of Kings. Now I talked about Chronicles of Narnia, which is still told in third person, but it's starting to bridge the gap into the stories that I love the most, that I feel are the most powerful, which are stories that know that they are stories. Authors that come out and tell you right off the bat that this is what you're going to get, and then they give it to you. So now let me give you the 2 examples of stories that have impacted me the most, that I've loved the most throughout my life. I'm not going to just say these are my 2 favorite books, but they're 2 of my favorite books. And one of them is my favorite fantasy series of all time called The Name of the Wind. And the other, I wanted to give contrasting examples and not just do a fantasy story so that I could help prop up my theory better by using different examples. The other one I'm going to use is Slaughterhouse Five by Kurt Vonnegut, which is way different than a fantasy novel. It's a commonly described as an anti-war novel, but Slaughterhouse Five is a story that knows that it's a story. So let me go ahead and start with Slaughterhouse Five and Kurt Vonnegut. So first of all, Slaughterhouse Five is a famous literary work. It's achieved the glory and the status that all authors dream of achieving, which is that it's in the canon. It's famous. If you go to any bookstore in the world, you're likely to find it, or maybe any American bookstore. It's commonly described as an anti-war book, and fairly so, because the story is about a man named Billy Pilgrim who was in the war and experienced the infamous bombing of the town of Dresden in Germany towards the end of the war. And the main topic of the book is that Dresden bombing and the events of World War II. So Billy Pilgrim travels around. We learn all about his life, and the gimmick of the book is Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. So we learn the story of Billy Pilgrim, but we jump around all through his life, from his day jobs he had and his interactions with his family before the war and his interactions with his family after the war, and obviously the events and the strange things that happened to him during the war. But why is this book so amazing? Why did this book become canon? Why did it achieve such great success? There are all kinds of anti-war books that have come out of, well, maybe all wars, but especially World War II is the most recent great war, so it's easy to remember. My point is just that a lot of authors wrote anti-war books, and I'm sure they were all sad, and I'm sure they were all touching, but not all of them became famous. Not all of them were as successful and as able to draw the reader in as this book was. And I would argue, I'm sure you can guess, I would argue that it's the story. Well, first of all, I'm not going to go into all the reasons why this is a good book. I love the technique about Billy Pilgrim becoming unstuck in time. That's an awesome technique, not one that Vonnegut invented. It's been done other times, I'm sure. Just that narrative device of, jumping around in time, not going, the narrative technique of breaking the chronological order. So not telling the story from A to Z, but breaking it up into pieces and jumping around. That's been done. That's been done a lot in books and movies. But even more than that, how fun that is and how unique that is. What's so fascinating to me about this book is the first 28 pages are Kurt Vonnegut talking. But it's not a foreword, it's not a prologue, it's actually the book, Slaughterhouse Five. So chapter 1 is Kurt Vonnegut talking, and then, at least in the edition that I have, it's 28 pages of him talking about his life, and him talking about him trying to write this book. So the book has a sort of first-person self-awareness and self-consciousness that it wouldn't otherwise have if it was just a regular anti-war book or just a rather regular story. So chapter 2 starts with the actual story of Billy Pilgrim. Chapter 2 is the real story. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. Billy has gone to sleep a senile widower and awaken on his wedding day. He has walked through a door in 1955 and come out another one in 1941. So chapter 2 is when the real story starts, and then we read all the way until the end, which is chapter 10, and that story ends with Billy Pilgrim and ends with the Dresden bombing. or the scenes around the events around the Dresden bombing. But so why do we need this whole first chapter, this whole 28 pages where Kurt Vonnegut is telling the story of his life and how he was just trying to write this book for a lot of his life? Here's how that starts, the actual beginning of the book. All this happened more or less. The war parts, anyway, are pretty much true. One guy I knew really was shot in Dresden for taking a teapot that wasn't his. Another guy I knew really did threaten to have his personal enemies killed by hired gunmen after the war, and so on. I've changed all the names. I really did go back to Dresden with Guggenheim money in 1967. It looked a lot like Dayton, Ohio, more open spaces than Dayton has. There must be tons of human bone meal in the ground. So what happens over the next few pages is Kurt Vonnegut uses all these short scenes, which is no coincidence. That's actually how the real story goes as well, is when we read about Billy Pilgrim, we get all these short scenes jumping around through his life. And then what's fascinating is that Kurt Vonnegut, in the first chapter, when he's talking about his life, it's the same thing. He's using these short scenes that only last for a page, or some of them are only a paragraph or two. And he's jumping around his life and talking about jobs he's had. But all of it is related to the story. It's all on theme, and it's all about the Dresden bombing and Kurt Vonnegut trying to cope with the war and the things he experienced in the war by writing about the war. So basically he tells us in this first chapter that he's tried to write this book all the time, throughout most of his life, and he talks about different conversations or things that influenced him as he failed to write the book, or a friend gave him a piece of advice or something. And then finally he gets around to the point saying, all right, I'm ready to write this book, and here's how it goes, and what I'm doing is looking back. And he gives that great image, or the great comparison of the Bible story about Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot's wife, who looked back and got turned into a pillar of salt. And so Kurt Vonnegut compares that to him, and he says, I'm looking back. So he's looking back at the war. So I'm a pillar of salt. I shouldn't dwell on the past, but that's what I'm doing with this book, is I'm dwelling on the past. And finally he says, I finished my war book now. The next one I write is going to be fun. This one is a failure, and it had to be, since it was written by a pillar of salt. It begins like this. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. It ends like this. Poo-tee-weet, which is the bird talking. So Kurt Vonnegut, he's kind of teasing us here, because he says it begins like this. Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. And he says it ends like this. Poo-tee-weet. So the ending is mysterious and arcane. It's the sound that a bird makes. That doesn't give us actually any information about how the story ends. But at the same time, I don't think it matters, because the important part for me is what I was talking about before, which is the confidence that the author instills in the reader when they let us know off the bat that they're going to tell us a story. So talk about being self-conscious that you're telling a story. The whole first chapter is Kurt Vonnegut saying, God damn, I spent my whole life trying to write this story. He's talking about the book that he's trying to write. And finally, when he gets around to getting to the point, or getting to the end of that explanation, he says, okay, I wrote my story. Here's my war story. Here's how it goes. It begins like this. It ends like this. It almost doesn't matter what he says. It begins like whatever. It ends like whatever. Whatever he says there, it doesn't matter, because the important part is that he knows exactly how it starts, and he knows exactly how it ends. And as a reader, I I surrender completely. I feel I let my guard down completely. Oh, he knows how it's even a payoff. It's even a brilliant little payoff when he says, "Here's how it begins. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time." And then chapter 2 starts and it says, and it actually begins that way. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. Even that, even though it seems so simple and cheap, is a huge payoff for me as the reader, because he said it was going to begin like that, and then it really began like that. And that's a little thing that is easy to overlook or undervalue, but I don't think you can understate how important it is, because whether I know it or not, which I have to believe, you got to think that most readers are not conscious of this. They're just reading. Most people are just reading the book like I was when I first read it. I wasn't trying to dissect it or figure out why it's a powerful story, because I wasn't trying to write my own novels back then. When I get that little beginning payoff, the story starts just like he said it was going to start, then I naturally want to trust and believe that it's going to end just like he said it was going to end. And so whether it's a good story or not, which it turns out to be an amazing story, I'm going to read the whole thing because I trust that this author is going to tell me a good story. So hopefully I explained that well enough, but you can see that there is a difference there. There's a difference between picking up that Stephen King novel where the beginning is everyone thought the man and the boy were father and son. They traveled from town to town, blah, blah, blah. When you read a story like that told in the third person, you just jump in at some point of this, whatever the author decides is the most relevant, most intriguing, most important point to start in, which is usually in media res. That's the common advice, is to, you should start in the middle of the action when the reader is going to be hooked right away and interested. Anyways, the author has to start somewhere, and then from there they start telling you the next event and the next event and the next event. There's a difference between that and then even, I guess what it is a self-awareness where the author is telling you, hey, I'm about to give you a story. Maybe that's maybe that's what I'm getting at. It's not exactly a first-person narrator thing or a third-person narrator. And the two examples that I'm giving of the stories I love really kind of blend the two techniques. So Slaughterhouse Five starts out with the first-person narrator of Kurt Vonnegut, and then he jumps into third-person narrator mode where he tells the Billy Pilgrim story. And maybe the whole thing that I'm getting at is that that self-awareness that what you're about to get is a story. For me, that's so powerful and human and natural. I'm surprised more authors don't take advantage of that. And I think that's why for the first-person narrator has power and is a fun technique. And I think it's becoming more and more. I'm kind of speaking out of my ass here because I'm not sure if this is true, but I feel like the first-person narrator is becoming more accepted and more mainstream, whereas it used to be sort of looked down upon, or, you know, literary snobs would thumb their noses at it. The first-person narrator is gaining more traction these days, I think, for that very reason, because it feels like your friend or your grandpa or the town elder or your spouse or whoever is telling you a story, and that's just natural and powerful, and we want to trust someone who's telling us a story. Makes me think of Catcher in the Rye. Wasn't Catcher in the Rye written that way? I forget. I'll have to look. I don't actually have that book right now, but I've been thinking about this more and more as I've read urban fantasy, because one of the biggest staples of urban fantasy is that it's told in the first person narrator technique. And young people seem to like that. If you read young adult fiction, it's all told, or it's mostly told in the first person narrator. But again, the power that I'm trying to understand here, the technique that I'm trying to get at, is not just about the narrator. It's more about the self-consciousness of the fact that this story is a story and I'm going to tell you a story. So now let me give my last example, my final example, my favorite fantasy series of all time, which is the Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss, which is not even finished yet. Hopefully he'll finish it. It's kind of he's kind of pulling a George R.R. Martin right now, where the waiting time for the next book just keeps getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. And a lot of readers are angry, but then again, when it finally comes out, just like with George R.R. Martin, everyone will read it and throw their money at it immediately. I've talked about Name of the Wind and the second book, Wise Men's Fear, before on this podcast. And they're good fantasy books by any rights. They have all the things that epic fantasy readers love. Fantastical worlds, maps, made-up cultures, a magic system that's in like Brandon Sanderson style, a magic system that's very well detailed. There's both mystical, unknowable magic and also scientific, learnable magic. There's the main character who's sort of the chosen one hero who, you come to find out that is, well, I won't spoil that, but it's a fantasy and it does fantasy really well. And I think even on its own, it could stand as a great fantasy novel. But what's always, to me, separated it and put it above the pack and set it apart from other fantasy novels is the technique in which it's told. First of all, the story structure is brilliant, the trilogy structure. What you have is a hero who's telling the story of his life. So imagine Superman telling us the story of his life, or imagine Walter White from Breaking Bad telling us the story of his life, or imagine Jon Snow as an old man sitting around the campfire and drinking ale and telling us the story of Jon Snow. You have a hero who is now not a hero. He's past his prime. He's sort of old and weak and fragile, and actually he's in hiding. So it's more than just that he's past his prime. It's that he's sort of lost his mojo. You have a hero who has lost his confidence, you have a wizard who can't do magic anymore. That's what it's like. You have sort of a shell of a hero who's telling his story, the story of his life. And he tells the story over the course of 3 days, and each one of those days is a massive, sprawling novel. So the first novel, he tells a big chunk of his life, his childhood and his adolescence, and that takes him a day to tell in the real world as he's telling the story. So again, very different, but in some ways similar to Slaughterhouse Five. In Name of the Wind, this, genre story, fantasy story, so he does it the reverse order of the way Kurt Vonnegut did it. Patrick Rothfuss actually starts out with third-person narration. So when it starts out, you're in a bar, again, fantasy. You're in the inn, and you have wayward travelers, fantasy. And you have a sword hanging on the wall, fantasy. And you have stories of mythical heroes, fantasy. But it starts out with third-person narration, so you don't actually know who your hero is or who you're rooting for right off the bat. It becomes clear very quickly, but you're in the bar and you're listening to these people talk, and you're listening to the townsmen spread rumors, and dark things are, things are bad, and the roads aren't safe anymore, fantasy. And actually it goes for quite a while. You get a lot of chapters. This book, if you're not a fantasy fan, you'll probably get turned off by this book because you have to really stick with it before it starts to really build up steam and pay off. But he starts with a third-person narrator, and you're in that world for a long time before the hero actually starts to tell his story. So if you think of it like Kurt Vonnegut and Slaughterhouse Five, you have not just one chapter, but many chapters of sort of prologue or leading up to when the real story begins. So when the real story begins and the hero, his name is Kvothe, when Kvothe actually starts to tell his story, then he tells it in first person. So then we jump into what you have is the old hero who's actually telling the story of his life in first person form. So I'll just jump to the point here, which is the transition part that I love so much. What happens in the beginning is there's an innkeeper, and we slowly start to learn that the innkeeper is the washed up hero, Kvothe. So there's a chronicler, a writer who travels to the town. He recognizes, aren't you this mythical creature? And Kvothe is angry. He's trying to hide. Obviously, he's pretending to be an innkeeper. He's like Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible when he finally gives up his life as a secret agent and tries to live the life of a normal person. That's what Kvothe is doing here. He's been this hero for a long time, and now he's trying to forget that life, which we know how that goes. It never works. He is trying to just be a regular innkeeper, but this writer is traveling through. He recognizes him. This writer knows the legends, and eventually, through a lot of back and forth, finally convinces Kvothe to tell his story. So Kvothe is grudging about it. He doesn't want to tell his story, but true to form, all people, we love talking about ourselves, and so does Kvothe. Eventually, he agrees he's going to tell his story. So as of right now, we're still in the third-person narration technique. Patrick Rothfuss is showing us these events, but we're not in Kvothe's head yet. We're just watching these interactions happen. So there's an argument. Once Kvothe agrees that he's going to tell his story, the chronicler is trying to save money and time and ink, and he says, well, how long is it going to take you to tell the story? And Kvothe says, if we're going to do this, we need to do this on my terms. This is going to take me at least a few days to tell the story. And the writer, the chronicler, kind of gawks at that, and he's like, I don't have the time or the ink to do that. And Kvothe is angry now because he wants his story to be respected, and he spits back at the writer, and he says this. Kvothe said sarcastically, his eyes gone hard again. I can tell the whole thing in one breath, he cleared his throat. I trooped, traveled, loved, lost, trusted, and was betrayed. Write that down and burn it for all the good it will do you. You needn't take it that way, chronicler said quickly. We can take the whole night if you like, and a few hours in the morning as well. Okay, so they're having this little exchange, and Kvothe is being sarcastic, and he's saying, well, if you're going to be a cheap ass, then let me just sum it all up in this one sentence. And that's a little thing, but again, it's not a little thing. It's not so insignificant. It's just like in the Chronicles of Narnia when the narrator says, these three servants, they're not important to the story because they won't come into the story again later. What that's doing, that little snippet where Kvothe says, well, hey, if you're going to be cheap about it, I can tell you my whole story. Here's how it goes, blah, 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 blah. And he says it in very general terms. He doesn't actually reveal to us what happens. He doesn't give us specifics, but it still gives the reader, now you know, now you see, now you know what I'm talking about. If you've stuck with me this long, now you know what I love about that. It still gives the reader that impression, that trust, that the storyteller knows exactly what story he's going to be telling us. So he knows the end, just like Kurt Vonnegut saying, it started like this, it ended like this, and he's showing that off to us. He's teasing us. He's showing us just a little bit of the goods and giving us that assurance that he knows the whole story. And now we want to go along for the ride. We want to know what happens, but we've been given that confidence. Then they keep Chronicler and Quoth go back and forth. More time passes, and then you have this great scene where Quoth starts to tell his story, but he's trying to figure out where it starts. So you have this great sort of meta scene where now our narrator, our first-person narrator, who's actually the hero, who's actually a character in the story, he's getting ready to tell his own story, but he's kind of not sure where to start it. So the storyteller is actually, so there's all these different levels of story going on here, and right now the storyteller is trying to figure out how to start his legend. So it goes like this, it says this. Chronicler dipped his pen, and Quoth looked down at his folded hands for as long as it takes to draw 3 deep breaths. Then he began to speak. Okay, now we're excited. The story's going to start, right? Quote, in some ways it began when I heard her singing, her voice twinning, mixing with my own. Her voice was like a portrait of her soul, wild as a fire, sharp as shattered glass, sweet and clean as clover. Quoth shook his head. No, it began at the university. I went to learn magic of the sort they talk about in stories. I'm going to skip a little bit here. I wanted answers to 10,000 questions and access to the archives, but what I found at the university was much different than a story, and I was much dismayed. Quoth shook his head again as if to free himself from some dark thought. But I suppose I must go even further back than that. If this is to be something resembling my book of deeds, I can spare the time. It will be worth it if I am remembered, if not flatteringly, then at least with some small amount of accuracy. But what would my father say if he heard me telling a story this way? Begin at the beginning. Very well. If we are to have a telling, let's make it a proper one. Quoth sat forward in his chair. So again, what's happening here? Quoth, the storyteller, he's kind of fucking around here. He doesn't really know where to start his legendary story. But what the author is doing, what I'm loving as a reader, and what the author is just spoon feeding me this sugar, this rich feeling that the author knows exactly what he's doing. He knows there was a girl and it started with her voice and the twining and the mixing. We know that that's a scene that we're going to get later on. And then he says, no, it really starts at the university. I went there to find the magic that you read about in books. So again, those are things, those are promises. That's what it is. This is all foreshadowing. This is all promises. This is all the author letting us know what we're going to expect. So he does more than the narrator in Chronicles of Narnia, more similar to what Kurt Vonnegut did when he's talking about the Dresden bombing and all that. Here, before we get the full story or the detailed story, we're getting glimpses. We're getting promises of what kind of scenes we can expect. So it builds up pressure on the author because now he's going to have to pay those off. But it builds up excitement in the reader. And that's why I think this narrative technique is just the best. It's the most powerful. It's the most intriguing, to me at least. And I've been fascinated by it ever since I read this novel, and I've been studying other novels that do this in more or less related ways, which are like the ones that I read to you already. I love it, and it's for that reason and a lot of other reasons, the prose style that he writes. I've said before that Patrick Rothfuss he's the only writer where I just want to keep reading. I can read any of his scenes over and over because the actual writing is so good. There are a lot of stories that I read where I've read stories before where the plot is good, but each individual chapter is not exciting. You just kind of are trying to find out what happens next. But in Patrick Rothfuss, the writing is so good that I can read. Each scene is its own little masterpiece, I think. So I hope I've done a good job of explaining that. I feel like it makes more sense to me now. It has something to do with the story, being self-conscious that it's a story, and those promises. That's so powerful and attractive to a reader, to me, to know that, just to be told, here's what you're going to get, and then to give it to you. There's something bold and powerful about that. So I'm going to end with the sort of catch paragraph, the thing, the catchy paragraph that is on Name of the Wind, what you see on the back of the books, the famous quote from Name of the Wind. I'm going to end with that, but I hope you've enjoyed this. I feel like I've explained this theory a little more to myself, so it's been really helpful for me, and I would love to hear if you made it this far and you know what I'm talking about, then I would love to hear if you've read any books. I know there are other books and stories that do this, that have these techniques that I don't know about or that I just can't think about right now. And I would love to hear if you have experienced anything like this in your reading or movies or TV shows that do this, because I want to keep expanding my knowledge of this. So let me know if you know what I'm talking about, and if you also like this, or if you know of other stories that do this, please. Okay, so here's how Kvothe really starts his story, right before we jump into the first person telling of when he's a kid and the hero story. Here's how the third person narration finally ends. Here it goes. Again, I'm going to skip around a little bit here, but here's the last few paragraphs. My name is Kvothe, pronounced nearly the same as Quoth. Names are important as they tell you a great deal about a person. Fantasy. I've had more names than anyone has a right to. The Adem call me Madre, which, depending on how it's spoken, can mean the flame, the thunder, or the broken tree. My first mentor called me Elir because I was clever and I knew it. My first real lover called me Dulator because she liked the sound of it. I have been called Shadikar, Lightfinger, and Six-String. I have been called Kvothe the Bloodless, Kvothe the Arcane, and Kvothe the Kingkiller. I have earned those names, bought and paid for them. I have stolen princesses back from sleeping barrow kings. I burned down the town of Treban. I have spent the night with Felurian and left with both my sanity and my life. I was expelled from the university at a younger age than most people are allowed in. I tread paths by moonlight that others fear to speak of during day. I have talked to gods, loved women, and written songs that make the minstrels weep. You may have heard of me.